Number 5. Robert Franklin Stroud. Stroud was transferred to Alcatraz, federal penitentiary in 1942, where he was held until 1959, per Federal Bureau of Prisons records. He never killed anyone at Alcatraz, but the man who arrived on that island in 1942 had already spent decades in solitary, and the federal government wasn't taking any chances. Robert Stroud grew up without stability, drifting into crime as a teenager in Alaska. In 1909, at just 19 years old, he shot and killed a bartender named F.K. von Dahmer, who he believed had wronged a woman he knew. Convicted of manslaughter, he was sent to McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary. He didn't settle. In 1916, inside Leavenworth Penitentiary, Stroud stabbed a guard named Andrew Turner to death in the dining hall in front of more than 1,000 inmates. The motive, by most accounts, was a dispute over a fellow prisoner's disciplinary treatment. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to hang. President Woodrow Wilson commuted his sentence to life in solitary confinement, following a lobbying campaign led by Stroud's mother. What followed was one of the most unusual chapters in American prison history. During his years in solitary at Leavenworth, Stroud became a self-taught ornithologist, raising canaries and publishing 2 respected books on bird diseases. He was celebrated in the press. The public called him the Birdman of Leavenworth. Then came Alcatraz, and the birds were taken away. Authorities considered him too manipulative, too influential. No birds, no research, no public image to cultivate. He spent 17 years on the Rock, much of it in the hospital ward, increasingly isolated. The chilling realization: Stroud was considered more dangerous as a thinker than as a killer. The government feared his mind more than his hands.
Number 4. Henri Young. Young was incarcerated at Alcatraz Federal Prison Penitentiary in the 1930s and 1940s, documented in Federal Bureau of Prisons records and the subsequent federal trial proceedings held in San Francisco. He arrived at Alcatraz already broken, and what happened there made him into something the federal government would spend years trying to explain away. Henri Young was convicted of bank robbery during the Depression era and transferred to Alcatraz in the late 1930s. In 1939, he and 5 others, including Rufus McCain, attempted to escape the island. They were recaptured. McCain was blamed, by Young's account, for the failure. Young was placed in the dungeon, solitary, darkness, cold concrete. What the duration was exactly is disputed. Official records and Young's own testimony conflicted sharply at trial. What is not disputed: when he was finally released back into general population, he stabbed Rufus McCain to death in the prison dining room. The killing was witnessed, the facts were not in question, but what followed was unprecedented. Young's defense attorney, James Martin Macinnes, put Alcatraz itself on trial. He argued that the conditions of Young's confinement, the prolonged isolation, the deprivation, had destroyed his capacity for rational thought. Medical testimony described symptoms consistent with psychological breakdown. The jury agreed. They convicted Young not of first-degree murder, but of involuntary manslaughter. He received an additional 3 years. The verdict sent shockwaves through the Bureau of Prisons. For the first time, a federal institution's treatment of an inmate had been used as a criminal defense, and it worked. The unanswered question: how many other inmates endured similar conditions at Alcatraz and never had a courtroom to speak in?
Number 3. Alvin Francis Karpis. Karpis was held at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary from 1936 to 1962. 26 years, the longest stretch of any inmate in the institution's federal history, per Bureau of Prisons records. He was the last man J. Edgar Hoover personally arrested. That alone tells you something. Alvin Karpis, known publicly as Alvin Karpis, was the operational mind behind the Barker Karpis Gang, one of the most feared criminal organizations of the early 1930s. While the Barker family provided the name, investigators and gang members alike acknowledged that Karpis was the planner, the strategist, the one who kept the operation running when others panicked. The gang's crimes included bank robberies across multiple states, armored car heists, and two high-profile kidnappings, those of William Ham Jr. in 1933 and Edward Bremer in 1934. Both victims were wealthy businessmen, both were held for ransom, both were released after payment. The ransoms, in today's terms, amounted to millions of dollars. The murders associated with the gang included the killing of law enforcement officers during robberies and pursuits. Karpis himself was linked to the killing of Sheriff C. Roy Kelly in West Plains, Missouri in 1931, though the exact chain of culpability in gang violence was legally complex. J. Edgar Hoover, who had been publicly embarrassed by claims that he had never personally made an arrest, flew to New Orleans in 1936 to arrest Karpis himself. Karpis later claimed in his memoir that Hoover didn't approach until the agents already had him secured. At Alcatraz, Karpis taught a young Charles Manson to play guitar. That detail is documented in Karpis's own memoir and cross-referenced in Manson biographies. The chilling fact, the most dangerous man on the island spent his time giving music lessons to a future cult leader. Number 2. George Machine Gun Kelly. Barnes was transferred to Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in 1934, following his conviction on federal kidnapping charges, per court records and Bureau of Prisons documentation. The name came from his wife. George Kelly Barnes was, by most investigative assessments, not the most lethal figure in Depression-era organized crime, but Catherine Kelly, calculating, ambitious, and acutely aware of public image, handed her husband a Thompson submachine gun and told him to practice. Then she told everyone who would listen that he was the most dangerous man in America. She built the myth. Alcatraz confirmed it. Barnes's most documented crime was the 1933 kidnapping of Oklahoma oil magnate Charles Urschel. The operation was brazen. Armed men entered Urschel's home during a card game and abducted him in front of witnesses. He was held for ransom and released after $200,000 was paid. What undid Barnes wasn't violence, it was Urschel's extraordinary memory. During his captivity, Urschel cataloged everything: sounds, smells, schedules, the timing of passing aircraft. His testimony gave investigators enough to identify the ranch in Texas where he'd been held. It remains one of the earliest documented examples of a kidnapping victim functioning as an active intelligence source. Barnes was convicted under the newly enacted Lindbergh Law, federal kidnapping legislation passed in the wake of the Lindbergh baby case. He was sentenced to life. At Alcatraz, he reportedly worked quietly and caused little disruption. Guards described him as cooperative. The fearsome reputation dissolved almost immediately on contact with the island's reality. He died of a heart attack in Leavenworth in 1954, having been transferred off Alcatraz years earlier. The verified but little-known fact, the nickname Machine Gun Kelly, never appeared in any law enforcement record until after his arrest. It was entirely a creation of his wife's publicity campaign. Number 1. James Whitey Bulger. Bulger was held at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary from 1959 to 1962, documented in federal records. His later murders occurred after his release and are separate from his Alcatraz tenure. He is included here based on his documented Alcatraz confinement and his status as one of the most dangerous verified federal inmates in American history. He sat in Alcatraz as a young bank robber. Nobody predicted what he would become. James Bulger arrived on the island in 1959, a small-time Boston criminal in his late 20s. He left in 1962 when Alcatraz closed. What followed over the next 4 decades was a criminal career that law enforcement officials have described as one of the most sustained and methodical in American organized crime history. After his release, Bulger rose through the Winter Hill Gang in South Boston, eventually becoming its dominant figure. Federal investigators in court proceedings documented his involvement in at least 11 murders, though the total number alleged by prosecutors was 19. His victims included informants, rivals, and individuals he perceived as threats. What made Bulger uniquely disturbing was the layer underneath. He was simultaneously an FBI informant. For years, he provided information on the New England mob, while his own crimes were protected or ignored by a corrupted relationship with his FBI handler, Agent John Connolly. He disappeared in 1994, tipped off that an indictment was coming. He lived as a fugitive for 16 years, appearing on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. He was captured in Santa Monica, California in 2011, living quietly in an apartment with his longtime companion. Convicted in 2013 on racketeering charges, including 11 murders, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, plus 5 years. In 2018, he was transferred to Hazleton Federal Penitentiary in West Virginia. Within hours of arrival, he was beaten to death by fellow inmates. The chilling realization: the FBI agent who protected Bulger for years was himself convicted of racketeering. 2 men, one a killer, one a federal agent, walked the same corrupt line for decades, and the system didn't catch it. A court did.